Welcome to Saving America. This is your host, Dr. David D. Shine. Our series of interviews for Saving America establishes that the world is full of interesting people. And I think once you hear from our next guest, you're going to agree that he is indeed an interesting person. Saving America welcomes Alan Mendenhall. He's a research fellow in the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies and senior advisor for the Free Enterprise Initiative at the Heritage Foundation. He develops strategy and leads outreach and coalition efforts on ESG and capital markets. Previously associate dean and professor in the Sorrell College of Business at Troy University, where he directed the Manuel H. Johnson Center for Political Economy. His contributions in the academic world and in media and publications would take up all of our time today. So just a few highlights include his frequent appearances on various media, including Fox Business, Fox News, Forbes, Newsmax, The Washington Post, The Washington Times, National Review, and U.S. News and World Report, just to name a handful. He received the inaugural Freedom and Opportunity Academic Prize from the Heritage Foundation. He is one of the few people out there who has more degrees than I do. And he has a master's, a law degree, a graduate law degree, and a PhD. We welcome Alan Mendenhall for his first appearance on Saving America.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
It's great to see you, and it's great to connect. And like I said, I've seen you on I tend to watch Newsmax different times of the day, and I've had an opportunity to see you there. So it seems like I already know who you are, one of those kind of deals. But in any event, we give our guests three key questions that are related to a recent article or something that you've been working on. One of the big issues, and I'm in academia, as you probably know, what is the story behind corporate DEI policies? What does DEI even mean? And I thought it was now gone with the new Trump administration, 18 months in there, that we didn't have to worry about this DEI stuff.
Well, there's a lot to say here. I guess just in the most basic level, DEI is the acronym that stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it manifested itself in the corporate world through things like bias training, mandatory training within the workplace, a lot of the HR stuff, hiring and promotion goals, diversity programs, diversity quotas, employee research things. You saw chief diversity officers developing in C-suites, and you would see DEI staff, DEI budgets, that kind of thing. And it really mirrored what was going on in the academy and the universities. So the universities, in particular humanities departments, developed all these concepts about institutions reinforcing power and domination and how knowledge and categories are influenced by power, and that any claim to neutrality deserves scrutiny. And so we saw this shift in the academic world, where people talked about racism at the individual level to racism at a structural level. So you saw ideas like intersectionality and counter storytelling and interest conversion, and the idea that oppression is systemic and that identities overlap, and neutrality was a bad thing. It could reinforce existing inequalities, and equity had to be the central goal. And so you combine all these things as students graduate from colleges and the ideas moved into organizations. The academic concept became common terms for discussing workplace issues. Corporations took them to public institutions. Companies developed all of these non-discrimination law and liability policies based on some of these humanities notions, and they expanded DEI offices and they expanded diversity efforts and all these kinds of things. But I like to say that the DEI acronym is actually incorrect, because instead of diversity, the D really stands for uniformity of ideas. Equity is really the unequal treatment of people. It's really discrimination on the basis of race. And inclusion means exclusion of everything outside of these narrow parameters. So, excluding Christian ideas from the workplace, excluding people who may be more qualified for the job in order to meet some type of racial or gender quota. So these are what DEI and these are how DEI manifests in the corporate world. Now you mentioned the Trump administration and what has gone on there, and I think that's important to point out because we dealt with a bunch of shareholder engagement with federal contractors that were still doing DEI
Mhm.
in the workplace. And that was particularly problematic because of some Trump administrative actions that were taken. So when the Trump administration took office in January 2025, one of the first things it did was end the federal affirmative action requirement. And that requirement had been in place for a long time. It had been in place since 1965. And Trump's executive order not only ended that requirement, but it directed federal agencies to stop enforcing affirmative action plans, to stop encouraging race or sex-based workplace balancing, things like that. Well, about 3 months after that, the administration issued a second executive order that was a little more sweeping. And instead of just saying, we're not going to enforce this anymore, this addressed DEI discrimination by federal contractors and said, we're prohibiting race discriminatory DEI practices now. It's not just that we don't want you to like consider that anymore. We're saying you can't do it. So no more race-based discrimination in hiring, promotions, recruiting, and vendor selection. And so essentially this made DEI illegal for companies to do. So when the Heritage Foundation started looking at his investment portfolio to see like, oh, which companies might be still using DEI in executive compensation, we were we were alarmed by some of the federal contractors that were actually
Mhm.
violating this executive order. And so that's what led to some of the shareholder engagement efforts that we did. But there's one thing just sort of philosophically to point out, which is it's always problematic when companies discriminate on the basis of race, even if it's for some goal that is to remedy past
Mhm.
discrimination or, some history of injustice, because we want to treat people based on their decisions, based on their actions, and not on surface level characteristics that are immutable, like the color of their skin. People can't choose the color of the skin. You're only born with the color of your skin. We want to reward people for doing good things, for achieving good things, or have people pay the consequences for making bad decisions or for doing bad things. And the entire DEI structure prevents that from taking place because you end up actually evaluating people's worth based on things they don't choose, based on the color of their skin, which is what historically, since the 1960s, we've been taught our whole lives that's wrong. You shouldn't do that. And yet that's exactly what DEI does.
Yeah, it is interesting to me, and just so you know, because my direct background is when I came out of law school, I went to work with Shell Oil in human resources as an attorney in human resources at a time when the Title 7 became a huge deal, and 11264 became the law of the land. And in fact, that is part of my early personal expertise. I mean, I worked for a big corporation. I did as many as 35 affirmative action plans for individual locations in 1 year. So I'm very familiar with the area. One thing I did want to point out that Trump missed, and this is unfortunately very characteristic of Trump. He's kind of like the 800-pound gorilla charges in. Uh, there are multiple affirmative action requirements. 11246 is only one. It's the big one because of the affirmative action plan. But recently, in reviewing contracts that for companies that may be federal contractors, we run into the fact that I don't see where he's eliminated the affirmative action plan for veterans and disabled veterans and stuff like that. So there's still some question in the air as what's going on. But e- it's interesting because, of course, the hero of the left was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Even Ginsburg is known to have said at some point affirmative action has to go away. And of course, Sandra Day O'Connor was also on record on the other side of the docket to say, it's been there about 50 years. It's time to take it down. So I again, even though that took some potential business away, frankly, I haven't done an affirmative action plan in 2 or 3 years for any of my businesses, clients, private clients. But it's interesting how this particular industry has changed. But DEI, I can tell you, having administered affirmative action plans, DEI never looked like a traditional affirmative action plan. I mean, it was something very peculiar. And being in academia, I personally experienced this. I was recruiting for dean positions, speaking of dean positions, and I was told only full professors, which I am, would be considered for this job. The headhunter told me, I can't believe it, Dr. Dave, you didn't get picked to be interviewed. In fact, nobody I picked to be interviewed got interviewed by this university. They hired a female associate professor for the dean position in that particular search. And this is the kind of thing that we encounter with DEI is that they're like, oh, well, this is the only pool of applicants we can consider. And it's like I said, I personally experienced it. And and again, that was in, you might call that not private industry like a big corporation. That leads to our second question. Tell us what you got involved with the guys up the road. As you know, we're in Houston, Texas. Dell we actually have some Dell equipment here in our offices in Houston. And I've been familiar with the Dell story for decades. So tell us how Heritage Foundation got involved with Dell Corporation.
So we started doing shareholder engagement. This is a pretty new thing for us. The first year we did it, we only did 4 engagements. This past season, we did 26, and we ended up withdrawing half of our proposals because the company either demonstrated to our satisfaction that it was no longer doing the thing that we engaged them on because we had discovered that they had been doing it, but they just hadn't been public about the fact that they had stopped it, or they agreed to stop doing what it was that they were previously doing. So I mentioned earlier that we engaged federal contractors that were doing using DEI metrics in executive compensation packages. Well, Dell was one of those. And we had
Yeah.
several companies that were doing it, and we engaged several companies on this issue. And as just one example of another one, we engaged Philip Morris, and to show that we we don't really well, put it this way. Philip Morris was our largest corporate donor. So we don't show favoritism. We go after anybody that we think is doing something wrong, but we try to make these engagements constructive. We're not seeing this as, oh, we're trying to attack these corporations for doing all these bad things. We actually just want to help these corporations get back to neutrality and be better corporations and to really improve their business model and to stop doing things that are toxic in the workplace. Dell was actually one of our most successful engagements. We had a great rapport with the people we engaged with. Our relationship was strong, and we still think Dell's probably doing some things that we would like to see them stop doing. I probably won't speak to those because we want to make sure we engage them privately, and as shareholders, hopefully we can get them to stop doing some of those things. Whereas we just sat here and I just aired everything aired every grievance I had, it wouldn't be, it wouldn't be a constructive engagement. But Dell was a great company to work with. We had some companies that weren't so great to work with. Amazon wasn't great to work with. Starbucks wasn't great to work with. But the vast majority of the companies we engaged with were actually really receptive to our engagements. And we would get lines like, thank you for bringing this to our attention. Thank you for finally engaging us. We have so much pressure coming from the left, from proxy advisory firms like ISS and Glass Lewis, from activist shareholders on the left that buy shares of our company just so that they can engage us and push our companies to the left, that all it took was somebody on the right to say something to get us to stop it. Nobody's asked us. Thank you for asking us. We've been waiting for a shareholder to ask us. Now we can stop. That was really the posture of several corporations we engaged with. And we didn't just engage on this issue of DEI in executive compensation.
Mhm.
We also engaged with regional banks that were in very conservative red states, which were doing things that were very much at odds with what their customer base would expect. For example, providing transgender care for minors in their healthcare plans and using
Oh my
the
gosh.
Poverty Law Center and their charitable giving screening so that if you wanted to give money, if you were an employee of these companies and you wanted to give money to Alliance Defending Freedom or Moms for Liberty or Family Research Council, you wouldn't be able to get an employee match because a company called Benevity, which does the charitable giving programs, would screen those out. So we got several companies to stop doing that. In fact, three big ones were Salesforce, MasterCard, and Meta. And we had great engagements with those three companies. At first, they said, well, wait a second. We don't think we're using the Southern Poverty Law Center's diagnostic tools. We don't think they're using their hate map. And by the way, we engaged
Uh-huh.
these companies about a month after Charlie Kirk's assassination. And Charlie Kirk had been assassinated only shortly after TPUSA had been added to the hate map, the Southern
Oh
Poverty
my
Law Center's
gosh.
hate map. So when we engaged those firms, they said, well, we don't think we're using it, but we'll do a deeper dive. And we said, well, why don't you look at what Benevity is doing? Because we think that you probably have your Benevity screens on. Sure enough, they did. They instructed Benevity to drop the screens. They did a deep dive into all their activities and assured us they weren't using Southern Poverty Law Center's diagnostic tools anywhere. And so we withdrew our proposal there. So we basically withdrew half our proposals, which I think is an incredibly successful season. And I think coming up this next proxy season, we're going to do at least double the number of shareholder proposals, but probably more than that.
And we're going to touch on that next because it's interesting for me. I didn't know who the Southern Poverty Law Center was. 10 years ago, an attorney teaching in a business university college. So I belong to a group of attorneys who it's called ALSB, and it's attorneys who teach in business schools. We teach ethics, business law, environmental law, that kind of stuff. So anyway, um, 10 years ago, the featured speaker at our annual conference was the president at that time of the Southern Poverty Law Center. And he was so extreme. Again, this is 10 years ago. He was so extreme that I went to the head. They have a professional person running the organization. And I said to him, if you ever book that group, that person again, or someone from that organization, I'm going to get up and make a noisy withdrawal from the luncheon. I said, just giving you a heads up in advance, don't do this. And in fact, that group, that specific group, booked their conference in Minneapolis this past couple weeks. And I told them a year in advance when they said, do you want to be in Chicago or Minneapolis for the next conference in 2 years? I said, neither one. I would not feel safe bringing my family to either place. I said, don't pick either. They picked Minneapolis. And it was interesting because I'm a regular at this conference. And they actually sent me a personal email, the current head of the organization, and said, hey, we noticed you haven't signed up for Minneapolis. You know, it's deadlines here. And I said, I told you 2 years ago when you were voting that I wouldn't go to either Minneapolis or Chicago. I said, I'm voting with my wallet, right? This is the thing. And I think people need to pay attention to that. Speaking of which, now you mentioned a couple companies, Amazon and Starbucks. And what I wanted you to talk about is our last few minutes here is who do we still need to look at, whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit? You know, I'm thinking about Harvard University apparently is really in a real tough battle with the Trump administration and the I don't know if it's the Department of Education, the Department of Justice, and a lot of that conflict, if you will, is over DEI or whatever anybody has renamed DEI, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And so I think looking at universities, we're still seeing universities rebrand, rename programs that are clearly DEI, and these are nefarious things. If you just look at the Smithsonian Institution's ideological chapter, if you look at the training materials that were used there, they
Hmm.
say that signs of nefarious white culture are the scientific method, the Protestant work ethic, politeness, objectivity. It's really astounding that people would flag those types of concepts as being, products of nefarious white culture. That's strange to me and very odd. And that's the type of stuff that you're seeing in a lot of these DEI programs. So we need to look basically up and down at government programs. I know here in Alabama, where I'm calling in from, we have all kinds of race-based discrimination on our boards and commissions where it says you have to have this many people from this community or that community.
Yeah.
And the problem when you have laws that say you need to discriminate against people, it's a problem because, they may say, oh, well, we've got to remedy this history of injustice, but how much discrimination is necessary to do that? For how long do you discriminate? Who decides which groups get to be discriminated against and which groups don't? And these are really troubling questions. It's just so much easier to have the law be racially neutral on all of these things. Then the law applies equally to all people. But to answer your question, we need to look at government, we need to look at universities, we need to look at nonprofits. In the Heritage Foundation are in particular, at least in the work I'm doing, looking at publicly traded companies where we hold shares because we are shareholders and we do want these companies to be better. We want corporate America to be as good as it can be. We're not trying to make enemies with companies. We're trying to make these companies improve.
Well, it's a really interesting area, and I think that flashing a big spotlight on. I mean, we're not talking about a flashlight anymore. We're talking about putting a big spotlight on this because, as I said, I've personally experienced some of this disproportionate response. And one example I use is again, I've been involved in employment law and human resources for 4 decades. And one of the things that I see is we never worried about who was gay. And there might have been some discrimination here and there, but it really wasn't an issue. And then all of a sudden, AIDS hit in the late 80s, early 90s. And employers went to me and said, well, should we not hire gay people because they might have AIDS? And I said, look, AIDS is not spread through casual contact, it's not spread in the workplace. Do not have sex with your gay employees, and you don't have to worry about AIDS. I actually said that to some of the business owners I was dealing with, tell you how blunt I am. And it's like, you know, this is not an issue. And it's interesting because one of the DEI preferences is, oh, well, we need to hire gay and trans people. But it wasn't an issue. I mean, I was a regular customer in suburban Richmond, Virginia, in the late 2010s, and there was a guy visibly going through transition. He's working at Home Depot and he's wearing a pink sweater. Nobody said anything. Nobody said, gee, this is a big deal. So it's interesting because all of a sudden we've got this cause celeb that I think is very misplaced. So it's kind of interesting. And it's interesting. I was at I did a kind of an industry tour with one of the chambers I belong to of a big Amazon warehouse here in Houston. And I can tell you, it looked like a very diverse place to work. I mean, I saw a pretty interesting collection of people. And so I don't know why they would say, when they need so many bodies to run that company, in addition to all the robots they're using, that they would say, oh, well, we're going to limit certain aspects of our hiring in order to meet some artificial objectives. And frankly, I think given the way the Department of Education, the Department of Labor, the Department of Justice are approaching things, I think that application today is going to be prosecuted, don't you?
Yeah, I think there's definitely investigation going on presently. And it's interesting when we saw the shift from just tolerance to coercion. It was no longer,
Mm.
you gotta allow us to live and let live, to you must bake our cake. And one resource that we rely on is the Alliance Defending Freedom's Viewpoint Diversity Score Index, and it evaluates companies based on how fairly they treat their customers, on religious beliefs. Do they avoid viewpoint discrimination? Do they protect employees' freedom of speech and religion? Do they prevent retaliation for lawful viewpoints? Things like that. A lot of it has to do with Christian employees and making sure that Christian employees are protected in the workplace. And then another resource we use is the 1792 Exchange's corporate bias ratings, and they are really good. They evaluate all kinds of companies on their giving and their hiring practices and where they put their money and their politics. So they look at if the businesses are denying services based on political or religious views, or whether their donations favor or exclude groups based on religious beliefs or political beliefs, or whether their hiring and workplace policies protect religious affiliations, things like that. And then they'll look at public statements. What are these companies coming out and saying? Are they voicing support for particular causes or candidates that might be offensive to people of faith? Or are they using company money to fund ideological causes? As shareholders, we definitely want to know that, because if the purpose of a corporation is to maximize profits for
Mhm.
shareholders, we want to know, like, if the money's being spent to to fund some sort of transgender cause or something like that. We want to know why is it being used? What benefit is the corporation actually getting out of that funding, or is it just sort of throwing away money to fund a leftist cause?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, we try and keep these reasonably short. You and I could go on for another couple hours, but I don't think our audience would continue to listen. So, Alan Mendenhall, it's been a delight visiting with you. How can our audience get more information about you and your work at the Heritage Foundation?
Well, our work at the Heritage Foundation is easy. You can just go to our website at the Heritage Foundation and look for the Free Enterprise Initiative. We highlight some of our shareholder engagements there. And then my website is just alanmendenhall.com, and that's ALLENMENDENHALL.
Thanks so much. This is Dr. David D. Shine for Saving America. Thanks for joining us today. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe at your favorite site, including Dr. Dave Saves America on YouTube.